The Galactic Council had existed for 11,000 years before humans ever looked up at the stars and wondered if something was looking back. 11,000 years of treaties, of border disputes settled over long conference tables, of wars avoided through careful words and careful silence. The Council liked to think of itself as the great civilizing force of the known galaxy. It had 43 member species. It had a charter written in 600 languages. It had rules for everything. Rules about resource extraction, rules about territorial expansion, rules about first contact, rules about the acceptable use of military force. And then, about 200 years ago, it found Earth. Humanity was, at that point, still arguing about whether to go back to the moon. The Council sent an observation team first, as was protocol, then a diplomatic envoy, then a formal invitation to join. Humanity, being humanity, spent 40 years debating the terms before signing anything. The Council found this irritating. Most species signed within a decade. But humans kept asking questions, clause by clause, line by line, until the Council's diplomats were exhausted and humanity's lawyers were just getting warmed up. When Earth finally joined, it did so with 17 amendments to the Standard Membership Agreement. No other species had ever negotiated amendments. The Council allowed it, mostly because it was easier than continuing to argue, and also because Earth's solar system sat at a strategic crossroads between three major trade lanes. Having humans inside the tent seemed smarter than leaving them outside it. Humans were assigned a seat on the outer ring of the Council chamber, the seats given to new, small, militarily unproven species. They were expected to observe, to learn, to speak rarely, and to vote in line with the Core 7, the oldest and most powerful species who had run the Council since its founding. That was how it worked. New members listened. Old members decided. Earth's representative, a quiet woman named Ambassador Sarah Voss, sat in that outer ring seat for 3 years. She listened. She took careful notes. She smiled at the right moments and said very little. The Core 7 assumed she was adjusting to the complexity of galactic politics. The truth was that she was watching how votes were called, watching which species were too afraid to speak, watching which rules were enforced, and which were conveniently ignored when they applied to the powerful. What she saw was not a council. It was a court, and the Core 7 were the kings. The first moment that made the galaxy sit up and pay attention came during the Rethian water dispute. The Rethians were a small, amphibious species, gentle, quiet, deeply communal, whose home ocean was being slowly poisoned by runoff from a mining operation owned by the Vorkai Combine, a Core 7 member. The Rethians had filed complaints for 6 years. The Council had formed committees, issued statements, scheduled reviews. Nothing changed. The Vorkai continued mining. The Rethian ocean continued dying. When the case came before the full Council for what the Core 7 planned to be its final, quiet burial in a subcommittee report, Ambassador Voss raised her hand to speak. The chamber fell into a polite, mildly curious silence. New members rarely asked to address the full chamber. She stood and said, very calmly, that she had reviewed the Rethian case files, the environmental impact studies, the Council Charter's environmental protection clauses, and the Vorkai Combine's own internal communications, which, she noted, had been obtained legally through Earth's new intelligence sharing agreement with 4 other Outer Ring members. She said that what she found was clear evidence of deliberate harm, knowing violation of Council law, and 6 years of coordinated obstruction by Core 7 representatives who had financial interests in the Vorkai Combine. She then placed the full documentation package into the public record before anyone could stop her. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. The Core 7 moved quickly. They called procedural violations. They questioned the legality of the intelligence sharing agreement. They had their allies in the chamber motion to have the documentation reviewed privately before it could be discussed. But the damage was done. The files were public. 43 species were reading them. And Ambassador Voss stood at her podium with the expression of a person who had expected every one of these responses and had prepared for all of them. The Vorkai operation was suspended within a month. Not because the Core 7 wanted it suspended, but because 14 Outer Ring members had suddenly found their voices, and because 3 Inner Ring members, species old enough to remember when the Council Charter actually meant something, voted with Earth. It was a small victory, a single case. The structure of the Council did not change. The Core 7 were embarrassed, but not broken. They sent quiet messages to Earth's diplomatic mission suggesting that what had happened was understandable for a young species, that Earth had made its point, and that it would be wise going forward to work within established channels. Ambassador Voss sent back a very polite reply thanking them for their guidance. Back on Earth, the incident barely made the news. Humans were busy with their own affairs, infrastructure projects, an election cycle, a football tournament of considerable importance. The people who did pay attention were mostly in government and military circles, and what they noted was not the diplomatic victory, but the reaction of the Core 7. The pressure, the speed with which they had mobilized, the quiet, practiced ease with which they had tried to make a legal documentation package simply disappear. Earth's Defense Council, a body created as part of the original membership agreement, responsible for assessing galactic threats, began meeting more frequently. They brought in historians, linguists, political analysts, and a small number of people whose job titles were deliberately vague. They began building a picture of the council that was very different from the one shown in the welcome materials. What they found was this: the Galactic Council did not keep the peace because it was just. It kept the peace because it was afraid, and because the species at the bottom of the hierarchy were more afraid than the ones at the top. The Core 7 had used that fear for thousands of years as a management tool. Species that stepped out of line found their trade routes inconveniently reclassified, their membership benefits quietly reduced, their complaints assigned to committees that never met. In extreme cases, and this was documented, buried deep in records that nobody was supposed to find, military action had been authorized against member species under the cover of anti-piracy operations. None of this had ever happened to a species with humanity's particular combination of traits. Humans were stubborn in a way that most species found biologically unusual. They did not respond to social pressure the way other species did. They had a remarkable tendency to dig in when threatened, to interpret a warning as a challenge, to treat an attempt at intimidation as useful information about what the other party was afraid of. Their history was full of moments where the logical response to overwhelming force had been, apparently, to make the force more expensive to use. They had a word for this: deterrence, and they had been practicing it on each other for centuries before they ever left their planet. The Core 7 did not know any of this. They saw a new species, a small fleet, a single seat in the outer ring. They saw something that could be managed. They were not the first to make that mistake. They would not be the last. But they would, in time, come to understand that there was a reason Earth had kept the peace at home for the last 100 years, and it was not because humans were naturally peaceful. It was because humans were very, very good at making conflict too costly to start. That lesson was coming. The galaxy just didn't know it yet. 3 years after the Rethian water dispute, the Galactic Council made its first serious mistake. It did not look like a mistake at the time. It looked, to the Core 7, like a reasonable and necessary correction. A small species called the Davari had been quietly sharing trade data with Earth, economic information that, when combined with documents Ambassador Voss had already placed in the public record, would have been deeply inconvenient for 2 Core 7 members currently under informal review. The Core 7 voted to reclassify the Davari's primary trade corridor as a restricted zone, citing security concerns. This was, in practice, economic strangulation. The Davari depended on that corridor for 80% of their external commerce. Without it, their colony worlds would begin to starve within 2 years. The vote passed 11-4. Earth voted against it. 3 other Outer Ring members voted against it. It did not matter. The resolution carried. Ambassador Voss filed a formal protest. She cited the charter. She cited precedent. She cited 3 separate legal opinions from council-recognized scholars. The Core 7 acknowledged receipt of the protest and assigned it to a subcommittee that had not met in 9 years. Voss returned to her office, sat down, and sent a single encrypted message to Earth. It contained no analysis, no recommendations, no lengthy diplomatic language. It contained 2 sentences. They just blockaded a species for sharing information with us. We need to decide what kind of member we want to be. Earth's response took 72 hours. That was unusual. Normally, the diplomatic corps responded within a day. The delay was because the message had not gone to the diplomatic corps. It had gone to a much larger meeting, one that included the Defense Council, the heads of 6 government departments, representatives from Earth's three largest independent space operations, and a retired general named Adissa Kamau, who had spent the last decade writing a very dry, very thorough academic paper about asymmetric power structures in historical empires. General Kamau, now functioning as an advisor rather than a commander, had a simple observation. He said that the Core 7 had made a classic error. They had punished the Davari to send a message to Earth, but they had sent it too early. They had moved before Earth had done anything threatening enough to justify the action publicly, which meant that every species watching now understood that the Core 7 would use collective punishment against any species that cooperated with humanity. This was not a demonstration of strength. It was a demonstration of fear. And fear, in a political system held together by the perception of authority, was the most dangerous thing a ruler could show. Earth's response was not a counter-threat. It was something more unsettling. Within a month, Earth had quietly established direct supply agreements with the Davari, civilian commercial contracts, technically outside Council military jurisdiction, routed through two outer ring species who had their own reasons for not asking too many questions. Food, medical equipment, industrial components. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that violated the letter of the restricted zone classification. The Davari corridor was restricted. The goods arrived by a different path. The Core 7 noticed. They issued a statement suggesting that Earth's commercial activities were operating in a gray area of Council law and would be subject to review. Earth's legal team responded with a 40-page brief explaining, in meticulous detail, why every single transaction was fully compliant with Council trade law, including 17 subsections of the trade charter that the Core 7 had apparently forgotten existed because they were written 800 years ago and nobody had needed to use them since. The gray area, it turned out, was not gray at all. The Core 7 had simply assumed nobody would ever read that far into the charter. This was the thing about humans that the galaxy kept underestimating. They were readers. They were, as a species, almost pathologically fond of documentation, of rules, of finding the exact boundary of what was permitted and standing precisely at that boundary with a pleasant expression. They had spent centuries building legal and political systems on their own world, fighting over every word of every law, and they had arrived at the Galactic Council with that entire inherited expertise fully intact. The Davari situation did not escalate into a confrontation. It resolved, quietly, with the Davari receiving enough support to weather the corridor restrictions, while the Core 7 realized that their punishment had, if anything, tied Earth more closely to the outer ring species they had been trying to isolate. But the incident shifted something. Other species were watching now, really watching. The Keth-Aaron, a mid-ring species with a long memory, sent a discreet communication to Earth's diplomatic mission. They had, they said, been observing with interest. They had also been compiling certain records that they had not previously known what to do with. Was Earth, they wondered, interested in discussing the formation of a more formal information-sharing framework? Earth said yes. Over the following 18 months, what began as a quiet information-sharing network between 4 species grew into something larger. 12 species, then 19, then 26. Not a block, not formally, nothing that required a council vote or a public declaration. Just a network of species who were sharing data, coordinating legal research, flagging unusual patterns in council decision-making. Most of them had grievances going back decades. Some had grievances going back centuries. They had never shared them before because sharing felt dangerous when you were alone. It felt different when you were one of 26. Earth did not lead this network. That was a deliberate choice. Humans understood, from their own history, what happened when a single powerful voice dominated a coalition of smaller ones. Eventually, the smaller ones stopped trusting it. Earth contributed. Earth shared its legal research. Earth made introductions. But the network's decisions were made collectively, and Earth voted like everyone else. Meanwhile, something else was happening back home. Earth's Defense Council had spent the last 3 years conducting a quiet, thorough assessment of galactic military reality. What they found was sobering. The Core 7 collectively maintained a fleet that outgunned everything else in the Council combined. They had maintained that advantage deliberately. There were treaty provisions, buried in the Charter's technical annexes, that placed limits on fleet development for outer and mid-ring species that did not apply to Core 7 members. The restrictions were framed as stability measures. They functioned as a cage. Earth had signed those restrictions without fully understanding them. Earth's lawyers were now understanding them very well. The restrictions applied to warships. They applied to weapon systems above a certain yield. They applied to military crew sizes and military vessel tonnage. They did not, because nobody had thought to specify it 40 years ago when Earth was negotiating its membership, apply to a category of vessel that Earth's engineers were quietly developing. Something that sat technically between a civilian research platform and a military ship, something fast and difficult to classify, something designed not to win a battle, but to survive one and make the next one unacceptable. Humanity called them watchmen, not because they were designed to fight, but because the best deterrent was knowing that someone would always see what you did and be able to prove it. The Core 7 were about to cross a line. Everyone close to the situation could feel it building. They were losing control of the narrative, losing the information monopoly they had held for millennia, watching their carefully maintained hierarchy develop cracks that showed up in every council vote. They had managed difficult species before. They had tools for this. Old tools, blunt tools, tools that had always worked. They did not yet understand that the tools would not work this time. Not because Earth was more powerful, but because Earth had spent those 3 quiet years ensuring that whatever the Core 7 did next, the entire galaxy would see it clearly, and that humanity would still be standing on the other side. The line, when they crossed it, would not be a mistake they could take back. The line was crossed on a Tuesday. Not that the Galactic Standard Calendar had Tuesdays, but the crew of the Earth diplomatic courier vessel Meridian was on an Earth time rotation, and it was definitely a Tuesday when they detected the Core 7 fleet moving into position around the Catharan home system. The Meridian was one of Earth's watchmen, officially designated as a diplomatic courier and deep space monitoring platform. Technically non-military, practically a marvel of passive sensor engineering capable of recording everything within a considerable volume of space with a clarity that no jamming system in the galaxy had been specifically designed to defeat, because nobody had known to design one. The Meridian had been running quiet observation patrols along the outer ring regions for 8 months. It had excellent records of a great many things. What it was now recording was a fleet of 31 Core 7 warships surrounding a member species without a vote, without a mandate, without any notification to the Council at large. The Catharan had, 3 weeks earlier, made a formal submission to the Council's Justice Division. They had submitted records, carefully compiled over years, shared quietly with Earth and 11 other network members before the formal filing, documenting what they called the systematic suppression protocols. Evidence that the Core 7 had, for centuries, been deliberately engineering the economic dependency of outer ring species, manipulating council votes through a combination of bribery and coercion, and in at least 9 documented historical cases, conducting military operations disguised as anti-piracy enforcement against species that had grown inconveniently independent. The submission hit the Council's public record at the same moment it was filed, because the Catharan had learned from watching Ambassador Voss. You did not give the powerful time to prepare a response. You made the record public before the meeting was called. The Core 7 had responded by sending 31 warships to the Catharan home system and announcing, in a statement remarkable for its bureaucratic blandness, that a security review of Catharan space was being conducted under Council anti-destabilization provisions. The Meridian transmitted its full sensor package to Earth in real time. Earth transmitted it to every species in the information network simultaneously. And then Earth's diplomatic mission called an emergency session of the full Council. The session convened with 41 of 43 species present. The 2 absent were Core 7 members who had sent notices claiming scheduling conflicts. The chamber had a particular quality to its silence when it assembled, not the polite, curious silence of Ambassador Voss's first speech, but something tighter, more electric, the silence of 41 species looking at sensor data they could not explain away and understanding, for the first time in the living memory of most of them, that the thing they had feared was visible now. Ambassador Voss stood at the podium for the second significant time in her career. She looked older than she had 3 years ago, and also, somehow, more relaxed, as if the thing she had been preparing for had finally arrived, and she found preparation more exhausting than the event itself. She presented the Meridian S sensor data. She presented the Catharan submission in full. She presented Earth's legal analysis, establishing that what the Core 7 had done had no legitimate basis in Council law, that the anti-destabilization provisions they had cited applied to external threats, not to member species filing legal documentation. She presented the 9 historical cases from the suppression protocol's evidence: 9 species, 9 anti-piracy operations, 9 quietly closed files, and she named each species by name. And she noted which of those species were still Council members, sitting in their outer ring seats, and which had not survived to see this session. Then she made Earth's formal demand. She called for an immediate, unconditional withdrawal of Core 7 forces from Catharan space. She called for a full, independent review of the systematic suppression protocol's evidence. She called for the suspension of the Core 7's voting rights pending that review. And she called for a constitutional convention to reform the Council Charter, to remove the fleet limitation asymmetries, to establish independent oversight of the Justice Division, to create a transparent voting record that could not be sealed or reclassified. There was another silence. Then the senior Core 7 representative, an ancient and deeply dignified being called the first speaker of the Vorkai, rose and spoke. He was calm. He was measured. He had been doing this for a long time. He said that Earth's demands were the demands of a young, inexperienced species that did not understand the responsibilities of galactic governance. He said that the stability of the Council depended on strong central authority, and that authority was the Core 7's to exercise. He said that the Catharan submission was a destabilizing provocation, that the sensor data from an Earth vessel was hardly impartial evidence, and that Earth itself was now demonstrating exactly the kind of reckless behavior that made strong central governance necessary. He said, with the weight of 11,000 years of institutional authority behind him, that Earth would do well to remember its place. The chamber was very quiet. Then something happened that had not happened in 11,000 years of Council history. One of the inner ring species, the Elvari, old enough that their civilization predated the Council itself, careful and slow and almost never vocal in chamber sessions, sent a representative to a speaking podium. She was small, with the characteristic pale luminescence of her species, and she spoke briefly. She said that the Elvari had reviewed the submission. They found it credible. They supported Earth's demands. They moved to call an immediate vote on the withdrawal of Core 7 forces from Catharan space. Another inner ring species seconded the motion before the first speaker could respond. The vote was called. The Core 7 bloc voted against. Every outer ring species, all 22 of them, voted for. The inner ring split, 4 species voting with the Core 7, 3 voting with Earth and the Elvari. The math was close. It was not close enough for the Core 7. The vote passed. They did not immediately withdraw. They issued a statement saying that the vote was procedurally invalid and that they reserved the right to continue the security review. But that night, 2 things happened simultaneously. Earth's entire Watchman fleet, 19 vessels, moved into open position, publicly announced, 1 per Catharan system entry point. They broadcast continuously on all standard frequencies, confirming they were conducting passive observation and recording, that all data was being transmitted in real time to Earth and to the Council's public data archive, and that they would remain in position for as long as Core 7 forces remained in the system. And the Information Network, 26 species, issued a joint statement, signed by all of them, saying that any military action against a member species under current circumstances would be treated as an act of aggression against all signatories. Earth had not threatened war. It had promised witness. And it had turned 26 species, frightened, small, long silent species, into something that looked remarkably like a unified voice. The Core 7 fleet began withdrawing 48 hours later. Slowly, in a way meant to look voluntary. But they withdrew. In the aftermath, as the Council convened working groups and the independent review process genuinely began, with investigators who had no Core 7 connections, because the Chamber had voted for that too. General Kamau, sitting in his office on Earth reviewing the transmitted records, wrote a short note to himself. He wrote, "They expected us to threaten them. We documented them instead. An empire can survive a war. It cannot survive 11,000 years of its own records." Outside, on the streets of 50 cities across a planet that had barely noticed any of this happening, ordinary humans went about their Tuesday. There was traffic. There were arguments about local politics. There were children complaining about homework and adults complaining about prices and someone, somewhere, winning a significant amount of money on a sports event. The galaxy had no idea how close it had come to something irreversible. Earth did. Earth was already thinking about what came next. The Constitutional Convention took 4 years. That was fast, by galactic standards. Most major council reforms had taken decades, had been delayed and studied and returned to committee until the urgency faded and the powerful found their footing again. This one moved because the independent review had done its work, and the work was devastating. The full Systematic Suppression Protocols report ran to nearly 2 million pages in its primary language. It documented not 9 historical cases, but 67. 67 moments across 11,000 years when the Galactic Council, specifically its core 7 members, had used the mechanisms of collective governance as a weapon against the governed. Species diminished, trade routes strangled, populations that had never known why their grandparents' generation suddenly grew quiet and careful and afraid. The records named names, dated decisions, quoted internal communications in which Core 7 officials discussed the suppression of member species with the comfortable, casual language of people who had never imagined anyone would read their private thoughts. The first speaker of the Vorkai resigned before the report was published. He did not explain why. He did not need to. The Constitutional Convention was not led by Earth. This mattered and was intentional. Earth's diplomatic mission had made a decision early in the process, a decision that General Kamau had argued for firmly and that Ambassador Voss had agreed with, that Earth's role in the reform process would be exactly as loud as necessary and not 1 decibel louder. The galaxy did not need a new dominant power. It needed a system that did not produce dominant powers. If Earth drove the reform process, Earth would end up at the top of whatever replaced the Core 7 hierarchy, and the lesson would not have been learned. Only the names would have changed. So Earth provided legal expertise when asked. It provided political analysis when needed. It offered its Watchman fleet as neutral election observers for the convention delegate selection process, because the one thing a Watchman did better than anything else was record things clearly and without bias. But the agenda was set by a committee of 11 species, none of them Earth, and the final text of the Reformed Charter was debated and written by delegates representing every member world. What emerged was not perfect. No document produced by 43 species with different biologies, different histories, and genuinely different ideas about fairness could be perfect. But it was something that had never existed before in galactic governance. A charter with actual teeth. Fleet limitations now applied symmetrically. Every member species faced the same caps on military development, scaled to their economic output, monitored by an oversight body with rotating membership that no single species could dominate. The Justice Division was separated from the main council with its own independent budget and a selection process for its investigators that kept council members out of it. The public record requirement, the rule that documentation filed with the council must be made public simultaneously, not held for review by a committee that could bury it, was written into the Charter's foundational articles, the hardest section to amend. The Core 7 were not dissolved. They remained member species. But the category itself was eliminated. There were no longer designated permanent power seats, no inner or outer rings. The chamber was reorganized. Every seat was equivalent. Voting weight was calculated on a formula that balanced population, economic contribution, and age of membership in a way that gave old species influence, but not absolute control. The night the new charter was ratified, Ambassador Sarah Voss sat in her office in the council building and did not celebrate. She was reviewing the amendment procedures. She wanted to understand exactly how difficult it would be for a future majority to reverse what had just been built. The answer was difficult, not impossible. Difficult. That was the best you could get. She sent a message to Earth that said, "Asterisk it holds for now. Keep watching." Asterisk back on Earth. The reaction was muted and genuine. There was no victory parade. There were news programs discussing the ratification, a fair amount of commentary from people who thought Earth had gone too far, and an equal amount from people who thought Earth hadn't gone far enough, and a significant portion of the population who understood the broad shape of what had happened but were more immediately concerned with their own lives. This was appropriate. Healthy, even. A species that threw parades every time it did the right thing was a species that had confused decency with heroism. The changes to the council rippled outward slowly, the way real changes always do. Trade routes that had been quietly suppressed for generations were reopened. Species that had been afraid to file complaints found that the complaints were now reviewed by investigators who did not report to the people being complained about. 3 of the 9 historical suppression cases that could be addressed were addressed, reparations made, acknowledgments entered into the public record. 6 could not be addressed because the species in question no longer existed. Those 6 were entered into the record too. Named, documented, not forgotten. Earth's Watchman fleet continued its patrols. It always would, not as a threat, but as a practice. Humans had decided, through the long grinding experience of their own history, that the best guarantee of any system was transparency, and the best guarantor of transparency was the unglamorous, continuous work of watching and recording and making sure that what happened was what was seen to happen. It was not exciting work. It was important work, which was different. General Kamau lived long enough to see the first post-reform council session. He watched it on a screen in a room in Nairobi with a cup of tea, and he noted that 2 species who had not spoken publicly in council chambers for 60 years spoke during that session. Carefully at first, then with increasing confidence, like people remembering the use of a muscle they had been told not to exercise. He found this more moving than he had expected and did not mention it to anyone. 5 years after the charter ratification, a young species made first contact with the council. They were small, technically limited, nervous in the way that any species would be nervous discovering that the universe was crowded. The contact team sent to meet them was not Core 7. It was a mixed delegation, 7 species, 3 from what had been the Outer Ring, representing the full range of galactic civilization. The welcome materials they carried were honest about the council's history. Not ashamed of it, not hiding it, but honest. Here is what this institution was. Here is what it did wrong. Here is what it is trying to become. Earth's representative on the contact team was not a diplomat. She was an anthropologist named Dr. Yemi Adeyemi who had spent 20 years studying first contact dynamics, and who had specifically requested this assignment. She brought no weapons and no legal briefs. She brought an extensive supply of patience, a thorough knowledge of the new species' observable communication patterns, and a firm belief that the most important thing you could do in a first meeting was listen more than you spoke. The new species was called, in their own language, something that translated approximately as the people who remember. They had, it turned out, been aware of the council's existence for 3 generations. They had been watching before they made contact, trying to determine what kind of institution they were approaching. They had made their decision to reach out based largely on the reform process, on watching a young species force a reckoning with an 11,000-year institution and come out of it with a better system rather than a new empire. Dr. Adeyemi asked them, through a translator, what had convinced them. The people who remembers lead representative thought about this for a moment. Then she said that what had convinced them was not the power Earth had demonstrated. It was the power Earth had not taken. Dr. Adeyemi wrote this down carefully and sent it home, and on Earth it was read by people who understood it and people who didn't, in roughly the proportion that described most important truths. Ambassador Voss read it. General Kamau read it, 3 weeks before he died, and he kept the message open on his screen for a long time. Outside the council building, in the vast quiet of the space between stars, 19 watchman vessels continued their slow patrols, recording everything, sending it all home, doing the work that made the peace not just a word but a practice, not a gift from the powerful, but a structure built by the stubborn, patient, thoroughly documented insistence of a species that had decided the universe deserved better and had the receipts to prove it. The galaxy was not fixed. It never would be. But it was, for the first time in 11,000 years, a little more honest about what it was and what it owed the people living inside it. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.